So it's an election year, in case you didn't know that. And I'm sure you may know that the last couple elections have had a lot of controversy and wild claims about them. But this is nothing new for American politics, or really politics anywhere. But here's a couple weird stories from past presidential elections. The election of 1800 was so weird that it led to a constitutional amendment. Prior to the 12th Amendment, elections were kind of a free-for-all. Whoever got the most votes became president, and the runner-up became the vice president. The election resulted in Aaron Burr tying with Thomas Jefferson. Both Democratic Republicans and both had 73 votes. Adams was in third with 65. Congress would be the tiebreaker. Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, didn't really like any of them, but saw Jefferson as the lesser of three evils. So he led a campaign to convince his fellow Federalists to vote for Jefferson. In a letter he said, and I quote, "Mr. Burr loves nothing but himself, thinks of nothing but his own aggrandizement." Of course, Jefferson ended up winning with Burr as his VP. And if you know anything about American history, or at the very least have seen Hamilton, you know this really didn't help Burr's feelings towards Hamilton. And it would come back to hurt Hamilton a few years later. Flash forward to 1824. The Federalist Party that Hamilton was part of was barely existent at this point. All four candidates in the election were Democratic Republicans. Andrew Jackson, a war hero and statesman, won the popular vote by less than 39,000 ballots, and had 99 electoral college votes. John Quincy Adams, who was at the time Secretary of State, secured 84, William Crawford won 41, and Henry Clay won 37. But no candidate had earned the majority needed to win, so like with Jefferson and Burr, the House of Representatives had to settle it. Clay was just kicked out of the running and it was between the three remaining. What made it a bit weird was Clay was the Speaker of the House at the time. Given that he had won the popular vote and the electoral vote, Jackson was pretty confident he would emerge the winner. Well, those who had supported Clay shifted their support to Adams, who would go on to win the election. After being inaugurated, Adams chose Clay as the Secretary of State. Jackson, of course, was mad. He accused Clay and Adams of what he called a, quote, corrupt bargain. He left his Senate seat vowing to come back and win the 1828 election. Jackson did come back with his new party, the Democrats, to win the 1828 election. He won 55.5% of the popular vote and 178 electoral votes to Adams' 83. You probably, or at least hopefully, know by the year that this was the last election before the Civil War. And one of the highest voter turnouts ever, 81.8%, Lincoln won by a landslide with 180 electoral college votes and just shy of 40% of the popular vote. John Breckinridge was the runner-up with only 72 electoral votes and 18% of the popular vote. The Democratic Party had been dominant since Andrew Jackson brought them to the forefront. And this is the election that tore them apart. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court basically legalized slavery in all U.S. territories. Republicans opposed this, but weren't ready to prohibit it in states where it was already very prevalent. At their 1860 convention, Democrats hadn't been able to define a real party line on it. And at their second convention of that year, they had nominated Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, but many Southern members opposed and selected Breckinridge, who was then the current VP. Both Breckinridge and Douglas would claim to be the official candidate of the party. Douglas came in second in the popular vote, but won hardly any electoral votes. Breckinridge took most of the South, however, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, who had no stance on slavery, won Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Weeks after the election, South Carolina seceded, followed by 6 others. The 1872 election had a lot going on already. The women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum. Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for president, with Frederick Douglass as her running mate. This was also the year Susan B. Anthony had been arrested for illegal voting. But what made 1872 really unusual was one of the candidates never saw the final vote. Horace Greeley, known for possibly the worst hair in American politics history, was the candidate of the newly formed Liberal Republicans. Not really meant to defeat Ulysses S. Grant, but meant to divide the Republican Party. Many felt Grant, despite having led the Union Army to victory, was out of his element as president. A visitor to Grant's White House described him as, quote, puzzled pathos as of a man with a problem before him of which he does not understand the terms. Damn. A few Republicans did split from the Republican Party to join the Liberal Republicans. However, Greeley's wife was sick and passed away 5 days before the general election. He himself passed away a month later, before the Electoral College had gotten a chance to meet, before the Electoral College had gotten a chance to vote. Grant did end up attending his funeral. Samuel Tilden defeated Rutherford Hayes in both the popular vote and the Electoral College. He was, however, one single Electoral College vote away from the 185 he needed to be declared the winner. Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon were all disputing the results. All across, the parties were accusing the other of fraud. Sound familiar? Nothing like this had ever happened before up until this point. So the parties agreed to establish a commission of 15 members, 7 Republican, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent. This, at least in theory, could have worked. The independent selected was Supreme Court Justice David Davis. Yes, that's a real name. But he was unexpectedly picked by the Illinois legislature to serve in the Senate. His replacement, Joseph Bradley, was a Republican who worked to make Hayes be declared the winner. Initially, Democrats tried to block the decision, but in a deal they decided to drop the effort if Hayes removed federal troops from the South that had been there for Reconstruction after the Civil War. So, that's what happened. There's a lot more to be said about the aftermath of that, but that's a topic for a whole nother video. The major parties in the 1920 election weren't terribly interesting. Warren G. Harding wiped the floor with James Cox winning over 60% of the popular vote in 37 of 48 states. But third place is where it got interesting. Eugene Debs had run for president as a member of the Socialist Party in 1900, 1904, 1908, and 1912. And he was trying again. If nothing else, the man was persistent. Only this time, he was doing it from prison. In 1918, he had given an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio, and targeted what he called, quote, the ruling class for sending the working class to war. And he was convicted under an espionage law and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Demonstrations protesting his imprisonment evolved into the May Day riots of 1919. He secured more than 900,000 votes, the same as he had done in 1912. But for comparison, Harding got over 16 million votes. The following year, Harding commuted Debs' sentence. Debs died in 1926, not long after being admitted to a hospital for cardiovascular issues he had developed while in prison. In 1948, nobody thought Truman stood a chance. Governor Dewey had it in the bag. Midterms in 1946 had resulted in Senate and House control for Republicans for the first time in almost 2 decades. And polls were showing that only 1/3 of Americans approved of Truman, a Democrat, and how he had handled the presidency. Not helping things was Commerce Secretary Henry Wallace was so angry with the administration's policy towards the Soviet Union, he declared to run as a third party. Southern Democrats were abandoning Truman, as well as forming the States' Rights Party and electing Governor Strom Thurmond, yes, also real name, and a segregationist, as their candidate. All polls showed Dewey defeating Truman. But, as I'm sure or hope you know, that's not what happened, because you've never heard of President Dewey. Truman was declared the winner in the wee hours of the morning. What made it weird was newspaper printers had gone on strike, forcing newspapers to publish their morning editions several hours earlier than usual. And that's how we got this picture of Truman holding up the wrong headline. In the 1972 primaries, George McGovern had won the Democratic nomination for president and needed to pick a running mate. He did very little vetting in his research and decided to go with Senator Thomas Eagleton. He thought having Eagleton would win the Catholic vote. Well, turns out Eagleton had been hospitalized 3 times for depression and undergone electroshock therapy. That wasn't a good look for his campaign, and it was decided Eagleton was too much of a liability. So 18 days after being selected as a running mate, Eagleton was dropped. Not like it made a difference, Nixon ended up winning the general election by 18 million votes and carrying 49 states.